Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. I'm really excited today that we're going to talk about international trade for the second week in a row. Last week, we had a great presentation by Michael Klein on the economics of international trade. And today, we're really looking forward to Kari Heerman presenting on geopolitical implications of international trade policy. We normally host this event in Beckwith's Recital Hall, but because Kari was bringing her family with, we decided to have it in the bigger venue to make room for them. But it's a warning to all of you that you're now on our mailing list. So now you're going to get all of our emails about our future events. So hopefully you come because you make the crowd bigger. So thank you for coming. So again, I just want to quickly read Kari's bio, and super excited she came. She's from Fargo. If you couldn't tell by all the people that are here to see her, she said that she's been in this building many times doing plays. So not speaking, but doing plays. So maybe you could do some tap dancing after you're done. So Kari Heerman is a senior fellow and director of Trade and Economic Statecraft at the Brookings Institution. Previously, Dr. Heerman was acting chief economist in the office of the chief economist at the U.S. Department of State. In that role, she led the office's team in its mission of providing advice and analysis on complex, emerging issues at the intersection of economics and foreign policy, offering tools to advance economic diplomacy and serving as a liaison to technical experts in economics across academia, industry, partner governments, and other institutions. Prior to joining the State Department, Dr. Heerman was Deputy Assistant United States Trade Representative in the Office of Trade Policy and Economics at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. She served as a senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, focusing on international economic issues from 2021 to 2023. Dr. Heerman began her federal government service as a research agricultural economist, studying issues related to U.S. and international trade and agricultural policy at the Economic Research Service of the United States Department of Agriculture. She received her PhD in applied economics from the University of Minnesota in 2013. Prior to pursuing a PhD, Kari worked on agricultural trade policy issues for the International Food and Agricultural Trade Policy Council, the German Marshall Fund, and the Hewlett Foundation. So as you can tell, she's highly qualified, really excited about what we're going to hear today. Let's all give a warm welcome to Dr. Kari Heerman.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks for being here, family, and also proper students of the university. It's a real thrill to be here. Very, as John said, particularly delightful to be in this stage where I had many dance recitals, and to have my family and many friends from church and from school in the audience who came and watched those and faithfully brought me roses. I'll be waiting after over there. You can bring me the roses then. But there'll be, sadly, much less tap dancing today than there has been in the past for me on this stage. Today, I'm going to go right to the heart of it, talk about something that I think is really central, both to our economic well-being and our place in the world, and that's trade policy. You may have noticed from the news that the U.S. appears to be in the midst of a pretty big shift in not just our trade policies, our tariff levels, but in the way that we think about trade and its role in our economy, upending some of the principles that have guided us in international economic policy for the last 80 years. As John just described, I've had many jobs in Washington, D.C. Most of them have been advising some leadership or another on international agricultural or international trade or international economic policy. And I've spent sort of 10 years in Washington on the front lines, sort of watching some changes happen in the way that leaders listening to their voters think about and look at international trade. Some of that evolution, some of that change in the way that they're looking at things is driven by real changes on the ground. Some of it is just major differences in philosophy by different types of leadership. So what I thought I'd do today is talk a little bit, yes, about the current tariff policy, but you can read about that in a lot of other places. There's a lot of good resources on that. But what I thought I would do a little bit more is talk through this evolution that I've seen over the past 10 years in the way that Americans and their leaders look at international trade, both in terms of economics and business, but also in terms of geopolitics and strategy. I'll try to give some insights into my story, of the story that I've witnessed. I'll try to give you a little bit of what my view is about where we are and where we could and should go from here. But I hope mainly to give you another piece of information for the conversations I hope you're having here at home about what you all think our international trade, our international economic policy ought to look like. And I'd be delighted not only to hear your questions at the end, but also to hear your thoughts. All right, so getting to the beginning with something concrete. This is a graph of the average tariff paid by importers, people who import things into the United States on US imports, by the things we actually import, going way back to before World War II, long time series. As you can see, tariffs have generally been low for many, many years. For my entire lifetime, they've been at or around or below 5%. A little drift down in the late 90s and early 2000s when we signed a number of free trade agreements. And then a tick up in the first Trump administration when we did targeted tariffs on imports from China and on imports of steel and aluminum goods. Those were mainly sustained for the most part through the Biden administration. And then in the last 9 months, we're back to where we were in the 1930s. This is a really, 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 really big change. That increase is not just one big policy. Our tariff rate is now 20%. It's the combination of many different policies, some imposing tariffs at the country level, some on specific industries. So how did we get from very, very low tariffs for a very long time to a tick up to this dramatic increase? I tend to think this in terms of the way that I've worked on these issues since I left Fargo in 3 eras. First is an era of consensus, where openness to trade, open markets rested on a really broad consensus that open markets serve both our economic and our strategic interests. Our foreign policy objectives and our economic objectives point in the same direction towards more open markets. Over time, we move into the era of weakening consensus. The consensus begins to be challenged because we start to see that the benefits of trade are not distributed equally over the society within the United States, and we start to see vulnerabilities emerge through trade channels that we start to worry about. And then increasingly over the past decade, the last 10 years, the questions that I fielded from the leaders that I worked for shifted from how do we leverage openness to make us even stronger to where should we draw the line on openness to hive ourselves off from vulnerabilities? We move into this era that I think we're in now, which I'm calling the end of consensus, where trade is seen as a vulnerability and an instrument of strategic leverage more than business. I want to emphasize that I'm going to tell a nice, pretty story with an arc because that is my job in this kind of an event. But I don't want you to think this story is complete, and I don't want you to think the story has been a cohesive arc that has been very linear. It's very jerky. There's still a lot of debate and discussion about where we are and where we should be, and these are really hard questions, and that's why. And the policy responses to some of the things that emerge over this time are not always connected to the challenge at hand. It isn't always glorious. Sometimes it's just protectionism and politics. So I will try, though, to sort of lay out what I think are the real challenges to inform the way that you think about this. All right, so starting back in the era of consensus, When I left Fargo in 1995, there was this new thing called the World Trade Organization that was the culmination of decades of trade negotiations starting after World War II. There was a deep alignment between our foreign policy and our economic policy. We believed openness serves prosperity and peace. We believe markets create both wealth and stability. These beliefs were the foundation for what we call the rules-based order in international trade. The rules-based order under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the World Trade Organization. And these things sound like international overlords, but really they're just a club. These are just clubs. The US was the main member, the lead member, bringing all its friends into the club. And in this club, what we ended up doing is to agree that if you're in the club, your imports are the same as anybody else in the club. We're not going to say Portugal's imports are different from Mexico's imports. As long as Mexico and Portugal are both in the club, we're going to treat them the same. If a fork comes from Portugal and it's identical to a fork from Mexico, it's a fork. Another key element of being in that club was an agreement that, for the most part, you're not going to use economic policy to enrich yourself at the explicit expense of another person in the club, another country in the club. We're going to avoid those kind of policies. We're all going to try to get rich together. And we also agreed that if we're in the club, we're going to settle disputes with a neutral third party is going to decide if somebody's being unfair or not. And this club worked pretty well. And the US was the leader of this club. And we showed we believed in this club and that we thought others should follow us by keeping our tariffs very low. We're not scared of competing with you. Our tariffs are low. Bring it on. We believe in this system. That's how we're going to show it. And, you know, I've described this as things that we believed, but it wasn't just beliefs. Those beliefs were supported by theory and evidence on the economics and the political side. So the economic argument's pretty straightforward. Everybody taken an economics class in this room at some point in their life? Yeah. This one you probably learned in Econ 101, the theory of comparative advantage. That says countries prosper when you specialize in what you do best and then trade for the rest. If you've got the Great Plains, grow grain, right? And buy, toys from a place where they have a lot of people working in factories. That is the way we can all prosper if we do that. But on top of that is an Econ 201 concept, and that's the concept of competition. So competition in general, in business anywhere, drives innovation, drives economic growth. And when you have very low tariffs, you're exposing yourself to even more competition. Competition from the best in the world is coming to your door. And that means that the static gains from just exchanging are multiplied by the gains from competition. That trade acts like a flywheel. It drives more and more innovation, more growth, lower prices, increased productivity, and it goes on and on and on like a flywheel, right? And it builds and builds. And that's where really the big gains from trade come from, is that process. And then with advances in communication technology and transportation technology and information technology, logistics got to be really sophisticated. And we could apply these forces not just at the level of a single final good, but throughout the supply chain. And production of goods went global. So the chair that you're sitting on, the podium I'm standing behind, is made up of pieces from around the world. It's not just, North Dakota specializes in wooden podiums and Portugal specializes in chairs. It's made up from a bunch of stages of production. And the benefit of this and the evidence of this is that prices for everything we buy goes down. Our paychecks all go farther. We can all buy more stuff. We all get a greater variety of things. I mean, when I go to the grocery store, there's like 17 countries I can choose a coffee bean from for just one brand. That gives us a lot of value. And, you can do things like, I grew up here in North Dakota in the middle of the winter. You can get a variety of fresh fruit. It's affordable and you can keep yourself healthy through the winter. My mom has to spend a little less time canning than she used to, although she doesn't, she still cans. But I think for pleasure. So that economic benefit of keeping our tariffs low and engaging in this club is supported by both theory and by evidence. Not only on the economic side, but also on the geopolitical side. We found that this club that we were building was a really powerful tool of foreign policy. Back in the Cold War era, the US and our allies formed this club. It knit together the economies of the free world. This helped us consolidate our alliances. It helped us recover from World War II, and it really anchored this Western bloc in a shared economic values. And over time, more countries joined our club. These rules had sort of a stabilizing effect. They gave confidence to global businesses that they could operate in a predictable market in the world. They knew that disputes between countries, if they were in the commercial world, could be managed by this neutral third party. They could really rely on and just do business and keep geopolitics out of it. Commerce, the world of commerce, could be really separate, for the most part, from the world of geopolitics and conflict. Now, of course, there's important exceptions to that rule, but they were contained, and for the most part, we just allowed business to operate globally. Over time, excuse me, cracks began to show. Slowly, this alignment between economics and geopolitics began to weaken and unravel. The economic logic still prevailed, the logic of efficiency and growth, and that on balance, this is good for us, was still there. But there began to be increasing anxiety about how the benefits of trade were distributed within our society. How can it be that some widget produced in Japan after an earthquake can't get to my factory and I can't go forward? Trade is disruptive. I'm anxious about that. I need to be more safe from those kind of disruptions. And then we started to have a real geopolitical shift from the end of that Cold War era where this club was built to provide value to the emergence of a new systemic rival, and this time that rival was already in our club and we were already deeply economically linked with, and that's China. So where did this come from? So on the economic side, one of the most vivid sources of this anxiety came from something called the China shock. Now I know John knows about the China shock. Has anybody else heard about the China shock? I just gave a version of this speech to a group of Chinese MBA students, and they had never heard of the China shock, and they were pretty alarmed by it too. It was really an interesting meeting. So what happened is that China went from being this very closed, isolated, very poor agrarian economy and made economic reforms that introduced some forms of capitalism into the country, and they began to emerge on a global stage. And this country of millions and millions and millions of very poor people, on the upside, started eating meat, started eating vegetable oil, and it created a great amount of demand for some of the stuff that we produce. On the other hand, these many, many, many people went to work in factories, and they were able to make quality and inexpensive goods. And those quality and inexpensive goods streamed onto world markets and created a very large surge of this import competition. The competition, yes, that spurs innovation, but it came on really, really fast, and it was quite alarming. And one of the things that happened as a result of that was that a number of American factories went out of business, and people lost their jobs, and it was painful. This figure on the left shows the share of US employment in manufacturing over time going way back to the 1950s. And as you can see, this is a relentless decline. The share of people working in manufacturing as we got richer naturally falls. There is a graph like this for every country, even China. As you become wealthier, the share of the population in manufacturing starts to decline. A lot of this is because you start to automate. The people that are working in your country start to do other things, and the machines make the stuff. A lot of this is driven by that, but it's also a little bit driven by these specialization in the things that we're good at and the increasing productivity when the competitor that can do it more cheaply and better comes online. You can see this decline is relentless, but what's a little bit harder to see, but if we zoomed in closer, we could, is that when China came online, that relentless decline sped up pretty noticeably. We had this big increase in import competition, and we started to see factories going out of business at a rate that was higher than we saw. The real problem, and that's just economics, that's the way things work, and it's painful, but it's not a huge part of our economy. But real problem emerged because of the second map. The second map is a county by county map of where that import competition hit hardest. And what is important about that map is that those red hot zones are where factories went out of business due to head-to-head competition with imports from China. That's not an even spread throughout the United States. That's a concentrated hit in those communities. And in those communities, those were already communities that tended to be vulnerable anyways. These weren't our high profile, high productivity, best factories in the land. These were communities centered around a factory that was already probably on its last legs. And those communities and those factories didn't get replaced with something else. Those places didn't rebound. Those people who lived there lost their jobs, and they didn't move to start working at Google or selling insurance or driving. Some of them drove a truck. Some of them, work in in-home care, but it wasn't the same thing. There wasn't a replacement. And the scarring effect on those communities from that experience was long-lasting. Now, the total number of jobs lost to the China shock, as John was just talking to me about before this, is small. It's smaller than annual turnover. But the problem was that those people lost their jobs, and those people in those communities couldn't find something else to do. In my view, that's a major failure of domestic policy more than it is a failure of trade policy. But nevertheless, this is the channel it came through. And nevertheless, those people who experienced that passed that experience on to their leadership. This next one is illustrates the political consequences of that experience. Those communities that were hard hit by trade and by automation and lost jobs really turned against trade. It's kind of hard to say, I'm against technology. It's really easy to say, I'm against China, because they're a foreigner and I can see them and I can blame somebody else. And so this caused Americans to turn against trade on that account. There were also environmental movements questioning the impact of these far-flung supply chains. There are also people starting to worry about security. What if we don't make the kind of things we need here? What's going to happen if we get cut off? Are we making ourselves vulnerable? This is a survey taken about Americans' attitudes toward free trade agreements from last year. And what this shows to me is that Americans do understand there are good things about trade. The first one says more Americans than don't think trade provides us a lot more variety of goods, and that's a good thing. More Americans than don't understand that competition through trade drives technological innovation, but more Americans think that trade increases prices at the store than decrease it. More Americans think that trade reduces the number of jobs, doesn't increase it. More Americans think that trade reduces the quality of American jobs available. And a lot of Americans think that trade is bad for American wages. Now, on the aggregate, in the whole, there's evidence against all of these things. But at the local level, the experience of individual people, some of these things bear out. And that really impacts politics. And that really impacts what they're asking of their leadership. And so you start to see a weakening of trade, openness, of trade policy focused on openness. When people think, yeah, I think it's great that I can get all those kinds of Starbucks, but fundamentally, trade harms my economic well-being. And that's the way the American people see it. And political representatives saw it, and trade became a lightning rod. And then we had a global pandemic. This is really scary and really crazy. We found out that when the pandemic came on, all of our masks were made abroad. All of our ventilators were made abroad. We couldn't get those things, in part because everybody in the world wanted them, and they wanted them now, and nobody could go to the factory and build anything because they were stuck at home trying not to get sick. We couldn't get the chips we needed to keep our auto sector going because the orders got all mixed up because people thought people wouldn't want cars, but then they did. And then the chips were made in Taiwan, and how can they get here? We sat at home and said, I have to wait for a bicycle for 6 months. I can't do it. I want to renovate my house. I can't get the lumber. All of these things come from foreign countries. How can that be okay? These global far-flung supply chains, once thought of the marvel of efficiency began to be seen as a source of fragility. When, the only place in the world that makes this certain kind of a pump is got a, COVID-19 is blowing up there and they're not letting anyone go to work. And so nobody can use this pump. And so nothing can be produced. You can't go to work. I can't get what I need. All of these things started to bubble up in this huge, massive emergency. And there came to be a realization that this invisible hand of the market might push prices down, might make things highly efficient, but it doesn't necessarily ensure that we're going to have resilience. If we get a massive shock like we did in COVID-19, we're not necessarily going to be able to recover as quickly as we want to be. And maybe we should start thinking about that too. This is the time when I was working in the White House, and this was on the mind of every leader that I talked to. Can you tell me what the next thing that we're going to run out of is and where it's produced and how we can stop it? Like, this is just crazy. You can't do that. So thinking about maybe we need a broader reorientation of how we think about these things. Sorry. All right. And on the geopolitical side, facts were changing on the ground too. The Cold War had ended and we had this new systemic rivalry bubbling up. The view in Washington on this is we let China into the club. We thought if they joined the club, what they would do was become more like us, agree to the rules, act like us, we're all going to get richer. But the view in Washington is they sure used those rules to get ahead, but they didn't follow some of the unwritten ones. Importantly, they aren't doing the kind of thing, they're doing the kind of economic policies that help themselves by harming us. And this isn't right, and this isn't working for us anymore. We started to see the emergence of what we like to call in Washington strategic competition. And this is, for example, China encroaching in the territorial waters of some of its small neighbors and saying, hey, we're here, this is ours now. And their small neighbors saying, no, this is ours, we have a treaty. And they say, oh, I'm sorry, we're not going to buy your pineapple anymore. How's that work for you? Good luck with your pineapple farmers, because they vote, sorry. This is a case where Russia decides Ukraine should actually be part of Russia. And we're going to enter and we're going to drive in. And the European neighbors say, no, 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 that's not right. You signed a treaty. We're not going to invade independent countries. And Russia says, oh, I'm sorry. Hope you like that cheap natural gas. No more of that. We started to see us throwing around economic power, the United States as well. And much the same as the US once used our economic heft as a tool of foreign policy, some of our adversaries started doing that too. And then this time, it wasn't in order to support the global economic order, this close-knit club of countries who had a common economic understanding. It was to take it apart. And that started to be really scary. So by the end of 2024, we're in a really different place than we were in 1994. By late 2024, my job was mostly, what are our critical sector vulnerabilities? How do we shut them off? How do we build coalitions to make sure that we can still get the things we need? How do we create resilience? What kind of incentives do we need to provide companies so that we make sure we have the chips we need? We make sure that we have the drugs we need. We make sure that we have the energy infrastructure we need. And how do we think, coming from the point of view where I was at the State Department, how do we think about this strategic use of economic power? What kind of leverage do we need? What kind of leverage should we use? How should we fight against the use of economic leverage? And so we're at a different calculus at the end of 2024, where there's starting to be less recognition of the economic benefits, but they're still there. The evidence is still out there. But we need to figure out how we can maintain those benefits while we mitigate the very real risks that are emerging and how to operate in this new strategic environment. And so we're at a new calculus. We need to rethink the way we do trade policy. And that brings us to the era that I call the end of consensus. That's US trade policy in 2025. Now, I wouldn't characterize what's happening now as necessarily a response to the story that I just told you. In some senses it is, but in some senses it's also just a rejection of that Cold War, post-Cold War world order. That whole fundamental belief that openness makes us stronger, that trade is a flywheel to build innovation and prosperity in our country. This is a really tense time in trade policy, as it is in all other aspects of life in America right now. And really trying to figure out where we need to be is a really hard question. So economic theory and politics and geopolitics aren't pointing all in the same direction right now. They're not pointing toward openness. Trade is framed as this zero-sum game. I win, you lose, I win. And any exposure to trade is seen as a vulnerability. Now, that's not the way that I see the world, but there are elements of truth in that. So here we are. I'll just review some of the policies that we've seen in 2025 so that we can talk about them, but I'm not going to go in deep here because you can get that information elsewhere. This is the statutory tariff rate over the last 9 months and how it's changed. The statutory rate means the rate on the books. So this isn't adjusted for what we actually buy or not. As you can see, this average tariff rate has changed very frequently, has shot up very high, and is now, as of a couple of weeks ago, hovering at about 17%. So we've gone from about 3 up as high as 25 or 30, and back to 17 over the last 9 months. This has been carried out, as I said, not in just one announcement that our tariffs will now be higher, but in a number of different actions with a number of different rationales, some of them connected to the story I just told, some of them not. The first set, I'm going to go through these really quickly. The first set are the kinds of policies used to increase tariffs at the country level. All of these things are happening through the use of executive power at the presidential level. These powers exist, but they haven't been used this much or in this way before. This is an unprecedented way to do trade policy. The first to go up were on China, Canada, and Mexico. The big announcement of tariff increases that happened in April were based on an assertion that we're in an economic emergency from trade balances at the bilateral level. That imposed a 10% base tariff rate on every country in the world, and then higher for some countries than others. The second type of tariffs that are called Section 232 tariffs. Section 232 is just the name of the legislation that allows the executive branch to undertake investigations into specific industries where imports may be a threat to national security. We've done a raft of these. Steel and aluminum has a legacy back from the first Trump administration. We've also done an investigation into auto and auto parts, into goods made from copper. The investigation into lumber and timber raised tariffs dramatically in the name of national security on vanities, on upholstered furniture, and on kitchen cabinets. Pharmaceuticals should be in the list of policies in place, and there are other investigations ongoing into semiconductors, critical minerals, heavy trucks, aircraft, drones, polysilicon, wind turbines, and new ones are coming online frequently. The third tool that the executive branch can use is called Section 301. This is an investigation into when countries are using unfair trade practices. This is the authority we use to raise targeted tariffs on China in the previous Trump administration. There are a few investigations going on here. And there's an understanding or a belief or an expectation, I should say, that if the powers used to raise tariffs around the world under this emergency power are ruled to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, that the administration will move to use Section 301 and do it that way. So what do economists think is going to happen from this? Perhaps your speaker last week gave you a little insight into this. I'll give you the short version. Well, we expect that those benefits that we see from trade, the static benefits from exchanging according to comparative advantage, and those innovation, technological change, low price effects that we see through competition are also going to erode over time. At the national level, trade in goods is just not a huge part of our economy. So I think I'm sure there are economists out there saying this is going to cause a recession. I think most of the economists I talk to don't think that high tariffs are going to immediately cause a giant recession. What they think will happen is that you'll see some price increases in final goods, but most of the stuff that Americans buy is not traded final goods. Most of the stuff we spend our money on is, going to the doctor, paying rent, Netflix, whatever else. This is a small share of what we buy. So it will be inflationary because prices will go up, but it isn't a huge driver of headline inflation. And it isn't a huge part of what we do in this country. So it's probably not going to immediately cause a recession. But over time, as those forces that compel us to be more innovative, those forces that compel us to have lower prices and faster technology and the higher costs that we have to pay for the stuff that goes in the things that we build, over time, that seeps in. And that is a longer term squeeze on the possibilities that we have in this country to be successful. And that's a harder thing. So that's at the sort of top line, headline national level. But there, I think, will be very acute disruptions to communities, to businesses, to industries. And this time, those will be the businesses that are most productive and highest technology and are champions, rather than the ones that are less productive. What do we see in the data? So that's what we think will happen. What do we see in the data? Still fairly early days. Most of these, the biggest tariffs only went into place actually in August. So we haven't had a long period of this. But what we can see from international trade, this is a graph of the value of import flows over the past 3 years stacked on top of each other. The red line is 2023 monthly import flows. The gold line is 2024 monthly import flows, and the blue line is thus far in 2025. We only have data through July, so we don't have data for August when the big tariffs hit. That's because the government is shut down and they aren't releasing data. But you can see that we had this big surge. Everybody sees these tariffs coming. We're going to buy. And that's another reason you might not see prices higher at the store for a while, because people are stocking up. You look 2 slides ago, tariffs are changing every few days. We don't know what's going to happen. We're just going to buy a lot now and hope that we can ride this thing out. What do we see on prices? As I said earlier, you don't see a lot in the headline inflation number here because traded goods aren't a big part of of what we spend money on, and because businesses might be holding off because they don't know what's going to happen with tariffs going forward. And because the way that they affect the cost of inputs kind of tends to be delayed in how they end up in consumer prices. But this graph does track where we'd expect to see the most direct impact of higher prices. This is a graph of a price index derived from prices at 4 major US retailers. And this is, as you can see, the prices were on a downward trend for both the blue line, which is I think domestic goods, and the orange line, which is imported goods. Prices had been trending downward since January since January 2024, and then they started to turn up pretty sharply about that time in April when the president came out in the Rose Garden and said, "We're raising tariffs on everybody. This is Liberation Day. These are our reciprocal tariffs." Those retail price indexes for both domestic and imported goods started to turn up. So this is what we're tracking. This is something that some academics track daily with this information from 4 big retailers. We're also seeing geopolitical events, which I think you guys are all too familiar with. Thus far, we're raising tariffs on everybody, and most countries are kind of holding back, seeing where this is going. The US is still a really important market for them, and the president is willing to use our economic leverage as much as he wants. They also don't think it's really in their interest to cut themselves off from the goods that they buy from the United States. So fighting against us doesn't seem to be a winning strategy. The exception, of course, is China, which is our systemic rival and who has about as big of an economic weight as we do. And they're pushing back pretty hard. In a lot of places that I've been in Washington, the real concern is that China is going to use its economic heft, its economic hold on the supply of goods to harm us. There's a real concern that China holds something like 90% of the refining capacity for some really important minerals that we need for all of our advanced technology stuff to build data centers, to propel our energy systems forward. And that's a real scary concern. But here in Fargo, you might be more concerned about the hold that China has over our market for something like soybeans. China usually at this time of year buys quite a bit, and they haven't bought anything since May. And that is not markets, that's geopolitics. And that is what happens when the break between the commercial world and the geopolitical world falls down. So I'll close with my own view. I've had a lot of years responsible providing concrete, objective theory and evidence to people making really hard decisions in a really confusing time and in a really confusing world. And they're not always making them just based on the economics, and they shouldn't always base them just on economics. That's not, I think, their responsibility either. But because I've had a front row seat to these challenges, I think it's important to think about them really hard. But on balance, my view is that the United States is still at our best when we can remain open, when we compete with the world rather than retreat from the world. But I do think that there are some real challenges. I think we need to think about socioeconomic tensions. I think we might be experiencing the reverse side of that here in Fargo right now. I think we need to think about what we learned from those disruptions during the COVID pandemic. And I think we gotta be realistic about how China and Russia and others are using their economic heft in this environment. So I think we have really hard questions to think about. So we can't think of trade just about prices and efficiency, but we really can't throw out those benefits either. That value is really important. So the challenge before leaders, in my view, is that we want to make sure that the United States is open enough to lead, but strong enough to endure. And what I want leaders to focus on is being good stewards both of our security and our value, our economic strengths. I want them to think about both of those things. I want them to identify where resilience is and where national security risks are, and then invest in finding the way to protect those things. And I want them to amplify our influence through collaboration and cooperation and global leadership. I think fighting with our friends does not help us advance this. We are in a big competition with a growing rival. And if we bear the cost ourselves by trying to fight it on a country-to-country basis, that's going to be much more expensive than if we build our alliance like the way we did during the Cold War. Trade policy is a real niche issue. I was apologizing to my cousin's teenage daughters who had to come here and watch this instead of what I used to do here, which was like tap dancing toy soldier and rocket. It was much more fun than this. But life is better when nobody has to think about trade policy except me and the other nerds. But this isn't a time like that. What we do on trade policy now really shapes the broader story and the trajectory of our country, how the US chooses to compete, how the US chooses to cooperate, and how the US chooses to lead. And I think that's a conversation that we need to have urgently among ourselves and with each other and with our leaderships. And so I hope I've given you a different kind of perspective that can enable you guys to continue having those conversations, which I'm sure you're already having. That's all I have to say. Thanks for your time.
I'll start off.
Yeah, great. Will you watch the time too? I don't have them. Okay. Okay. Yes, absolutely.
So, I'm wondering, so your perspective has kind of been an insider to a certain extent. So I'm wondering what the future of the World Trade Organization is like to you, because I know the United States didn't fill the appellate body, so disputes could not be heard, and I'm wondering, I know current policy is not favorable towards the WTO, but I think that the future of the WTO is going to be able to rely on going back, hopefully go back into the World Trade Organization for.
Yeah, great question. He asked about the future of the WTO, emphasizing the importance of the disputes resolution mechanism, this neutral third party where countries disagreed, they could resolve disputes there. I think the WTO is maybe on life support at best. This institution, I think there is a real conflict there because China and Russia are in that club. It's really hard globally, not just for the United States, but for a lot of countries. There's a lot of mistrust and there's a lot of competition within that organization. And having the principle of the whole organization is that you can't discriminate between one country and another. And fundamentally, in the world we're in, there needs to be some way to discriminate. So optimistically, what I want the US to be doing, what I wrote many memos about, is that we should be thinking really hard about what we want that club to look like. And we should be doing the groundwork, working with our allies and saying, this is what we need to change. These are the concrete things that we think are scary. These are the concrete things that aren't working for us. It's not just, it's not fair, real concrete things. What are the ways we need to change the rules? What are the ways that we need to get, what do we need to do? What are the guardrails we need to get back to a place where we can move more of the commercial world back to the commercial world and separate it more from geopolitics? I'm not super optimistic about the WTO. I don't think they're going to burn it down. I don't think they're going to shut it down. They'll continue to turn the lights on. We might even continue to pay our dues, but it's becoming an institution where some rules are still working. Some meetings are still happening. We're still talking about, standards for, pesticides. Those things are happening. It's not valueless, but as an institution that really upholds this wall, I don't think there's a constituency for it in Washington. And I think that constituency is starting to weaken in other capitals as well, unfortunately. Yeah.
Like the United States, a strong dollar, and Canada, dollar. That's a huge advantage for Canada versus us, because they get paid 30 to 40% more on not only the goods, but the transportation being shipped here. Why isn't that more of a factor on worldwide? Because the United States strong dollar is a huge disadvantage for us, and setting tariffs and stuff to offset that unfairness.
Yeah, having a strong dollar is a huge benefit to us. Having a strong dollar means we can buy more stuff than anybody else for cheaper than anybody else. It means that we can borrow money cheaper than everybody else. It means we have higher wages and our paychecks go way farther than anybody else. It's a huge asset to us. In certain manufacturing goods where it's just cost head-to-head competition in cost, and you're going to pay less, that there is an advantage, but it doesn't. It's mostly for things that are not differentiated, and it's not a huge number of goods where the value of the dollar is really the thing that pushes you over. Yes, on the margin, when the dollar falls, you do have some gains in terms of your competitiveness externally, but the trade-off there is usually it means you're actually poorer. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about if that is real. I trust the word that international companies or nations were charging our products a higher tariff than what we were charging those nations. But talk a little bit about the fairness of that, the reality of that. We always hear about the tariffs that we charge, but have not heard anything about tariffs that nations.
Yeah. So the question is about reciprocal tariffs. Is it true that other countries were charging us higher tariffs than we were charging? Sometimes, but I think fundamentally our belief in having low tariffs comes from the fact that it's not in our own self-interest to have high tariffs. It's just a different philosophy about if you think that this is a contest and you want to have tit for tat, if you charge a high tariff, I charge a high tariff. That's one way to go about it. But the evidence shows that why would you tax yourself to buy something? If another country wants to have a high tariff on autos to make them more expensive for their industry, that's fine, but we're not going to do that. That's been more the attitude. So yes, we generally have lower tariffs than other countries. Product by product, there are things, we have pretty high tariffs on sugar. Countries that are competitive in sugar don't. So there are things that we have high tariffs on, and we, more than having just uniformly low tariffs, what we did was negotiate, here are the things that we want to hive off. These are the things that are really important to us. We're going to have some high tariffs here and low tariffs on everything else. So yes, we had lower tariffs than everybody, but fundamentally that's because we thought it was in our self-interest. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I think for the most part. I think we might have to recalibrate some things, but for the most part, I mean, I think the evidence shows that it is in our self-interest to take on that competition where we can. In the back. BRICS and the new currency. I don't think it's that much of a threat. So for those, I don't know if everybody follows, that's a great question. You are a total international affairs nerd, and I love that for you. The BRICS is a new club. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's a club of emerging economies in the early 2000s that were just kind of put together as sort of like, here's the next rising stars of the global economy. And they now have formed a club that also is increasingly including other more adversarial partners. Iran is now a part of BRICS. And this is a club that starts to think about how can we maybe become the center of economic power. One of the proposals they have is to build a rival to the dollar. So one of the best things we have is that we have the currency that the world uses to buy and sell stuff. Instead of holding a little bit of everything, if you want to buy something from Argentina, you don't have to change it into pesos, you can use dollars. If you want to buy oil, you use dollars. If you want to buy anything, almost all international trade operates using dollars, and that creates a lot of benefit for us. We get rent off of people using that dollar, and that's what gives us extra low interest rates, a little bit of higher wages. I just had a podcast about this the other week. But you know, we can also use that weight to cut people off when they do bad things. We impose financial sanctions. We say, Russia, if you're going to invade Ukraine, you can't have dollars. You can't use dollars anymore. You can't use them to buy semiconductors to put in drones. You can't use them to sell your oil. You can't have them. You're cut off. Your bank accounts are cut off. And that gives us a ton of power. And those countries that start to see the US throwing that around, they're a little nervous about it. They'd like to still be able to do naughty things and have money to do it with. And they are thinking, maybe we create an alternative to the dollar. I don't see anybody knocking down the door to hold those a BRICS currency. It's a loose organization with a lot of self-interested countries. I think we're a long way out from that being a real threat, but it's something to watch for sure. Go ahead.
So that everybody looked at manufacturing, but not that much of a population involved in manufacturing. Nobody ever talks about global services. Great.
Thank you. You're my new best friend. I talk about the role of services in trade. And when every time a new administration comes in and they ask about the trade balance, I say, it is the goods and services trade balance. And they say, take those services out of there. He asked, what about the role of services? The services industry is really what this country buys and what this country does. Truck drivers, insurance salesmen, doctors, lawyers, accountants. Globally, more and more employment and more money goes into services than it does into stuff, because stuff is increasingly made by robots. So this is a really important sector in our economy. But there's a little bit of this that is identity more than it is economics, right? So when your identity is tied to the fact that generations of my people have been making cars and mining coal, that the salience of that and the power of that is what shows through. I think you experienced that a little bit with agriculture. I mean, that same graph for manufacturing, there's the same thing in agriculture, only it happens way earlier. It happens generations ago. You know, when our great-grandparents were here, everybody worked on the farm. And gradually more and more people move out of town, and fewer horses are used to plow, and more combines. And the thing that my brother drives now is just a computer on wheels. It's a marvel of technology. And this happens in agriculture as well, and even faster and earlier. So I hope people talk about services. I hope they talk about trade. If you look at Trade and services is harder to count because you don't see something come across the border and then put a sticker on it and say you can go into the store now. But especially with increased digitization, traded goods and traded services trade is skyrocketing over the past 25 years in a way that it will continue to do. And it's something to really watch. Yeah. I just want somebody to be working on it. Right now, I don't think that there's many people working on it. I think probably you guys talking to your representatives in Congress. Yeah.
You think the WTO, they could work better by restricting membership to economies that have better consensus?
Right. I keep forgetting to repeat the question, John. I'm so sorry. But he asked about the WTO and whether it can be made to function again if we restrict membership to countries that agree to follow the rules. I don't know how this could play out. There's a bunch of different ways. There are definitely institutional ways that you can change things at the WTO, but you have to have the willingness of all the parties to do it. There are things that you can get around that a little bit. You can do sort of like what they call plurilateral agreements, where a certain set of countries will agree to operate in one way, and the rest of the members, you're still in the club, you get a lot of the benefits, but you're not in the like VIP lounge access. So there are people talking about doing those kind of things. I think it'd be really hard to kick a country out of the WTO. But you could have a subset of countries say, we have decided that we're going to recalibrate. You can increase your tariffs. You just have to say, we're increasing our tariffs, we're changing it, and you can respond to that in a way that offsets it. You could have a subset of countries in the WTO hive themselves off and say, this is the new club. But I don't know. I don't know what that'll look like. I think there's a lot of, it seems to me like people in Washington and people in my group talk about that a lot, but it doesn't seem to me that the people who are making policy decisions want to do that at all.
Is there a mechanism for sending an invitation to join that it's in retrospect seems unsafe?
He asked if there's a legal mechanism in the WTO to kick someone out. I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think there is. Yeah. Next question.
Are there any policies to talk right now to increase our resilience?
That's a great question. He asked, are we trying to increase our resilience? Many people are thinking super hard about this. My fear is that people think tariffs will fix it. And I just think that's a load of hooey. It's not. Border measures aren't going to fix those things, especially just sort of broadly applied. But I think a lot of people are thinking about that. And I think it's quite possible that border measures might be part of that package. In the previous administration, there was an attempt to use industrial policy together with border measures to try to address some of the resilience in certain sectors. I don't know that they had the secret sauce quite there yet. I think there's a lot of thinking need to be done. My view is that this isn't something we should do just, domestically, that this is something that's better to do with a broader group of countries because it's very costly to address some of those things. And a good way to address some of those concerns is through innovation. And we're not going to get it if we just hive ourselves off. Hi.
Can you address a little bit the link between tariffs or the economic strategies and immigration issues?
That's really hard. So he asked if if I would address the link between tariffs and immigration. I don't know, that feels like a political linkage for the most part. This is just not my expertise. I will say one of the alternatives to trading goods is and being able to produce what you need is to invite people to come in and do that thing here. Both people that are skilled, who have innovative minds. We're now charging them $100,000 per person to come in, and that's not affordable. And also at the low end to invite people to come in. And if we want to manufacture things here and my cousin's kids don't want to go build washing machines, well, maybe somebody else from a place that's less stable wants to come here and help us build washing machines. That's a way to address that if we have concerns. But so that's the way that I think about that link. But it's not the hot button way that it's mostly talked about, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Let's be able to successfully acquire ideas, create that for the rest of the world. So what do you think? I guess that is a solution that actually.
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of.
Yeah. Yeah. He said one of the reasons we might be having troubles taking global leadership is because we are no longer as economically powerful relative to the rest of the world. I'll say two things. One, you're right that there is another economic weight that has a very different idea of what things look like. But I would not say that we are a weak country by far. We are this. You can witness this in the fact that that our long-standing allies are not retaliating against us. That investment is still coming into the United States. That the dollar is still the dominant currency in the world. We are the best thing going, even when we feel weak. And I think our leaders like to tell us we're weak and it's a foreigner's fault. And I don't think that's right. I think we need to find where our heart and soul is and take that on again, because we are still the most powerful country in the world. I had this week in Washington is the annual meeting of the IMF and the World Bank. And that means the central bank governors and the ministers of finance of the world descend on Washington, D.C. and they talk about hard problems. And sometimes some of their staff come over to the Brookings Institution where I work to say, what do you guys think about what's going on? I've had a lot of meetings about that this week. And I've asked a lot of representatives from a lot of countries, yeah, why aren't you retaliating? Why are you still thinking about investing over here? And their opinion is, we don't see a benefit from going over to China. We don't trust them. We know the American people. We know this country, and we think this is the best alternative for us for now. But things could change, and we're watching really closely. It is a close calibration right now. So it's something to watch. I also had a group come in from a think tank, a Chinese government think tank, come in and talk to us a few weeks ago, and I asked them, are you seeing countries coming to you and looking for opportunities as a response to what's happening in the United States? And he said, not really. They're still really worried about our overproduction and the impact on their economies. They're still worried about on freedom. They're still worried about some of the surveillance in China. So lucky us, China's still a little bit worse. But we do have something that I think we need to steward and take care of. That's really precious. Sorry.
Upstairs today. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for an excellent presentation. And I hope the Heerman family is all presentations as well. So let's give one more up.